Remember the lyrics to your favorite songs from your teenage years, but can't seem to remember where you put your keys? Was there a time during a class when a story or analogy brought you to an aha moment and the content finally clicked? What you experienced in those moments, likely unaware, was a form of embodied learning. Our objectives in this lesson are to define embodied learning and the role emotions play in learning, identify different techniques of embodied learning and why they're effective, and after observing a learning event, be able to describe how embodied learning was used and apply these to future learning opportunities. So what is embodied learning? Simply stated, embodied learning involves being attentive to the body and its experiences as a way of knowing. It's recognizing that our mind and our body are interconnected rather than distinct when we're learning. Various terms that are used include embodied learning, embodied cognition, and somatic learning, which comes from the Greek word soma, or body. But all of these depict being more aware of what your body is experiencing when learning occurs, and understanding that the body is an instrument for learning. Embodied learning can also be spiritual in nature, which Tisdale defines as connection or meaning-making, or constructing knowledge through unconscious and symbolic processes. Just like that connection between your favorite song and those lyrics that you can still sing in the shower when no one's around. Embodied learning is related to experiential learning in that learning occurs in the experience itself, not just as a result of it. When embodied learning causes a new thought pattern or changed action, it produces transformational learning. While we can develop a greater awareness with attention and practice, embodied learning is usually informal and incidental, happening during the course of daily living. An event occurs and it triggers a response, and through reflection and action, we learn. Through our bodies, we experience emotions. These emotional connections help us make sense of our experiences and enable meaningful learning. Because it's impossible to separate the mind and the body, it's also impossible to not have emotions and then experience those physical effects in our body. The brain is subject to millions of stimuli every second, so it has to filter out what is meaningful and then delete what is not. Primarily, it does this through pattern recognition. So by making associations through the use of metaphors, analogies, experiences, and emotional hooks, the brain remembers more readily and then learning is enhanced. It seems easy enough to understand that physical movement would be considered embodied learning, but there are far greater applications for us to discover. Through the use of symbols such as art, music, and film, as well as writing, storytelling, and playing games, learning can occur using the body along with the mind. In physical activity, such as dancing and sports, the use of the motion of the body facilitates lessons in discipline, problem solving, and stress management. Shovel studied the movement of female basketball players and how they learned to move in sync on the court. This also explains why a dancer's body seems to move without effort or thinking. The learning has been embodied. Art and its counterparts, music and film, can also play a critical role in opening up the connection between emotion and memory. By creating transformation through what Masereau described as disorienting dilemmas, we studied that last week, the affective domain is activated, challenging assumptions and opening the mind to new learning. Art has also been shown to contribute to emotional healing, from which learning and transformation can result. If you recall, 2 weeks ago on the discussion board, we talked about experiential learning, and I posted about the art classes that I used to co-facilitate with another artist teacher, where we used art to help emotions be released, therefore facilitating healing. It was the physical act of painting that allowed this learning to happen. Writing, both a physical and cognitive experience, can also produce embodied learning. In a study of creative writers, Tobin and Tisdale discovered that simulations of what the characters were experiencing when writing, even so far as to physically roll around on the floor, caused a greater knowing of the character. The author's body then became a site of learning, and their stories became significantly more real. One of the studied authors used an interesting metaphor to illustrate his embodied learning experience by saying he was so in tune with his characters that he knew down to his ribs. Storytelling, an ancient form of teaching, also engages the senses, heart, and mind to broaden knowledge. Sharing experiences and hearing those of others helps us understand one another, and it can even disrupt stereotypes. In adult education, the use of storytelling makes the curriculum content more real, more immediate, and more personal. Does this look familiar? Is it possible that you can play at work? Yes, you can. When you consider a study by Martin, which analyzed the use of this paper toy chatterbox, or fortune teller as most of us recall it to be, to model the use of questions in collaborating a positive workplace culture. The tool generated a definitive emotional response from participants, with comments such as, "I remember this from my childhood." The resulting outcome of the game was a cultural change and an environment which became more conducive to open-ended questions. I'm going to bet their questions were probably more important than the ones we used to ask, like, "Does the boy next to me like me?" So I know what you might be thinking. I'm not so sure about all this artsy, touchy-feely stuff and embodied learning. But keep in mind, as I mentioned before, you can't shut off your emotional brain, so this type of learning happens whether you recognize it or not. In fact, have you noticed that none of my slides have words? That's because I'm using embodied learning to teach you about embodied learning. I'd like you to try another way to gain an understanding of embodied learning. In my undergraduate music class, I was introduced to the work of Benjamin Zander. He's a conductor for the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra and is famous for his charisma and energy, both in his music and as a speaker. In 2008, Zander spoke about the transformative power of classical music. While watching it, I found myself moved by his message, and it resulted in a transformative experience for me in not only my enjoyment of classical music, but in my understanding of people. What I didn't realize at the time was that the reason I was so moved was because of his use of embodied learning. As part of your assignment this week, I'll be asking you to watch his 20-minute TED Talk and identify how he uses embodied learning and how it impacts you. A little tip for those of us, since we are in the OLL program, also be on the lookout for his leadership applications that he makes. I think you'll enjoy them. So how can we take the idea of embodied learning and transfer it into our workplaces and leadership? Nordhaus references Schuler's work in 2010, which states that leadership training tends to be primarily cognitive and conceptual, and it would be more effective if the body were brought into the experience, creating human knowing and long-standing changes in habits and values. So as leaders, we need to ask ourselves, how can we use what we've learned about embodied learning to inspire others in a new, stimulating and motivating way by engaging both the mind and the body? I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and have gained a greater understanding and appreciation for embodied learning, even if you're not the touchy-feely type. Becoming more acquainted with its benefits and exploring how the mind and body intertwine brings new dimensions to the learning experience. Even in the workplace, the practice of embodied learning can foster environments of new ideas, personal enrichment, and unimagined organizational value. I look forward to engaging with you on the discussion board about this unique and fun form of learning. Thank you.